Rui already did the presentation. If you want to find me online, you can find me either at the community or via LinkedIn. In the community, you'll find some plugins that are already shared that are available for everyone to use. So go check it out, follow me, just say comment, whatever. Today's topic, the workflow automation in Figma design, is going to be done in the perspective of a designer, meaning I'm not a developer. I'm not someone who codes for a living or of any kind. I do it for fun, as a hobby, and as an extension of what I do already in part of the design. For me, it's also important to develop my skills in not only JavaScript and TypeScript, but also some HTML and CSS in these plugins, because I like to understand those technologies for my day-to-day work as a designer. So, as you probably know, you can automate Figma design in some different ways, via shortcuts, via templates. You can create a new file and duplicate it, use templates from the community. And of course, you can use scripting and plugins, and that's going to be our focus for today. There are some prerequisites to actually being able to start scripting or creating plugins, which are having some knowledge of TypeScript. TypeScript is just an extension of JavaScript. It's basically JavaScript plus notation. So if you know JavaScript already, if you are comfortable with it, you are more than ready to start. If you are not that familiar with either JavaScript or TypeScript, you can start to learn either via Grasshopper, which is a project by Google. It's basically like an app that teaches to code via puzzles and small things, so it's easier to grasp the concept. It's not like very hardcore, but if you want something a bit more technical, you can check the Odin project. Of course, they are more online, just a couple suggestions from me. If you want to know more about TypeScript itself, you can discover the language in TypeScriptlang.org. We have all the official documentation. So for today, I'm not gonna deep dive in these topics. I'm really gonna focus on showing examples and more or less the way you have to think when creating a plugin or a script for Figma. The second prerequisite, of course, is knowing something about the Figma plugin API. There's two APIs for Figma, the plugin one and the REST one. We're only going to focus on the plugin API today as well, but you can actually use both together. For example, one of my plugins, the version history to Slack, uses both to accomplish get information from Figma, sending it to Slack. Personally, I didn't start to study the documentation page by page or anything like that. But it's really important for you to at least go through the initial pages of the documentation, understanding how plugins are set up, like the sandbox, how they interact with Figma, so you just have a better understanding of how things are working behind the scenes. Of course, then to actually create scripts and plugins, the best way is just go to the documentation pages and use search function and try to find what you're trying to look at. Second suggestion, go to Figma forums or go to the Figma / now becoming Discord for developers. Become a part of the group, and then you can post questions and be part of the discussion. So the session goal is basically to help any beginner create their first script or plugin. Considering scripts and plugins, there are really a good amount of stuff that can be automated. Just to showcase some examples. The main one is changing any property associated with the layer in the properties panel, which is basically the panel on the right-hand side of Figma when you're in the canvas. You can change a layer hierarchy, change the position of it. You can duplicate a layer, you can rename a layer using, for example, content within that layer to rename it, for example. You can get component instances from local or shared libraries. So for instance, you can build a plugin that automates a creation of a template or something like that, and basically grabs lots of stuff from different components. Or you can create something that changes all the variants you have or all the components you have in a page to different ones that have a different meaning. One, for example, is for light theme, or another is for dark theme. You can apply a style from a local shared library. Once again, dark theme and light theme is one of the examples that come to mind. You can change the content of a text layer. You can store information. This one is really important. For example, if you want to create something like copy pasta, my plugin that basically copies the position and the layer and then pastes that layer in the same position in different frame. What I do is basically grab all that information from the original source, store it in Figma, and then use it to copy to the other way, to the other place. And you can use it for all different things. For example, on Schema, the last Figma conference, Rocky King was actually showcasing a small script where you could actually put a video associated with specific components. So basically, we have like video documentation for each component. So when we have like a component in the share library, that information is then accessible by anyone who uses that same plugin to then fetch the information. You can change the selection of layers, you can change the viewport position, and you can connect to external services via API. And of course, you can either join all this together or just do your own use case. Really depends on what you're trying to solve, and basically imagination is the limit. So just to start, I want you to think of the most repetitive task that you usually do, something that is really annoying and you really dislike doing, because it's actually like something that's really low value. And I want you to keep that in mind. And as long as I will go through an example, I want you to try to see if some of these things will actually help you to solve your own problem. So this example is what we'll try to solve today, which is trimming the frame height to fit its contents with a certain value of padding. Just to explain better, let's say that I have like mockups for a website and I basically finished them all up. Now I'm preparing them for handoff, and I want to make sure that at the end of each page we have like a padding of 60 pixels, meaning this becomes the end product. What I can do, what I can do here is basically go one-to-one by hand, drag it up, make sure it's like flush with the last element, and then add 60 pixels. Issue, well, you have to do one by one. It's time consuming. And of course, if, for example, you have different constraints for each one of these frames, you have to remember to press Control or Command, I think. Sorry, I'm a Windows user, sorry if I don't know the shortcuts for Mac, but you basically have to press the Ignore Constraints shortcut in the keyboard while you drag with the mouse. Otherwise, if you go like directly to the layers, to the properties panel and change the frame height, you're gonna affect those constraints. So what's the quantitative benefit of doing an automation? You can, for example, use this to justify to your boss or your manager why you think you should actually automate a part of your daily workflows. You can consider how many steps it takes, how many times you do it a day, how much time you spend on it. Of course, that you, for example, look at my example, I probably don't do that like 10,000 times a day. So the saving amount of time is not that great. However, I honestly prefer to look at it more as like a qualitative benefit, because it's more error prone, because I might be able to grab a frame and mess everything up because of these constraints. And I end up with frames with different sizes or anything that's actually not the correct dimension I was looking for it. And most of it, it's like really annoying for me to do something that has low value as just like making sure that like the end of each frame has the right position, especially because that position is the same for everyone. It's like keeping the same 60 pixel. So there's a native function in Figma, but as you might be aware, it trims the frame all around. So if you have like the original frame here and you do the resize to content or resize to fit or something like that, you end up with this and not our goal, which should be this one. So first things first, before actually trying to automate this by itself, let's check the community. Like there's so much great stuff there, so many assets, so many plugins. Perhaps someone had the same problem as us and already solved it. Honestly, today I was checking that someone did like a cool plugin to check comments while we were basically on the design on the canvas, and you can actually use that to check comments from other pages. So it's a really cool plugin that I actually really wanted to have, and it's done. So always go check the community first and try to use different keywords. One of the most interesting thing I find out on trying to promote organically copy pasta was that people call that specific function of duplicating a layer between different frames totally different stuff. So until I actually found what people were calling it, no one was actually found it. And then when I found the right keywords, then the installs really started to go up real fast. So for example, I tried 4 different keywords here. I tried frame, I tried artboard, I tried crop, I tried fit. And between these, I found out 2 possible solutions: auto hide and artboard tricks. If you look at the latter, what artboard tricks allows you to do is actually fit. It's basically the same function as Figma native function, but it asks you for a padding. So you can actually have the padding, which is one of the goals we have for my example. However, it's all around it and not just in one direction. So artboard tricks doesn't solve the issue. Second example, auto hide. Auto hide does the correct version of actually just trimming the bottom section of the frame, but doesn't ask you for a padding. So no bug here as well. Auto hide actually has a couple of bugs as well, where, for example, if you have two layers within the frame which are at the same Y, or so basically they have the same distance from the top, but then one is larger than the other. In some occasions, auto height doesn't crop by the end of the larger layer, it crops by the smaller layer. So it's something to actually have in mind when you develop something to automate what I was trying to solve. So you can start writing a script or building a plugin. What's the difference? You probably already heard a lot about plugins, but scripts something you don't usually hear about. A script, honestly, is just something that you write but run within an existing plugin. It has some constraints, but for some small use cases, or just to start testing a concept, just to make sure that you actually know how to automate it or that your idea to automating it works, you can actually run small pieces of code within one of these 2 plugins, and then actually save it and have like a script there. So for anything that's just an automation that you use here and there, not very often, it's okay because you don't have like to go within the plugin and run it. You can just, you don't have to build a full plugin for it. You can just go here within scripter or workflows and select the specific function. Today, we're going to focus on using scripter, but it's really easy to use. So the idea here is actually more to focus on the code. The plugin itself is really self-explanatory. You click a plus, you get a place to write code, you run it. It's really easy to use. So let's analyze our problem again. So we're going to trim the frame height to fit its contents with X padding. If you look at the way each section, the sentence is written, we can grab small parts and associate it with a specific function. So for example, for trim height, we're going to change a property, which is the height of the frame. You have a frame, so we basically have, if the user selects different things, we have to make sure that you are only affecting frames. And this is something important because, as you might be aware, Figma has different types of layers. So you have text nodes, you have rectangle nodes, you have ellipse nodes. When you're writing a plugin or script, you have to always to make sure that you validate the selection. Wherever you're trying to affect, you have to make sure that it's the right thing you're trying to get. So you have to make sure it's not an empty selection, that you're targeting the right type of nodes that, for example, in this case, you want to actually read the contents within the nodes. So you have to make sure that those nodes are not empty as well. If they are empty, just discard them and not consider them for the trimming. So you have always to keep in mind all the possible solutions. Like one of the top tips you always have to think when developing is like develop for all scenarios. One thing is when you're trying to develop something for the community, because it's going to be used for different people and everyone has like a different way of trying to use things, and they are more prone to error. If you are just building a script to be used by yourself, you can be a bit more relaxed, and well, if it throws an error, well, you just like ignore it and you make sure the selection is actually okay, and you can actually run the script again. It's totally fine. So you can always manage what you're trying to achieve here. And for the final function, ask for user input to get that specific value for a padding. Why? Just because, for example, we wanted to set 60 pixels for that case, but for some other project, it might be 80, 100, whatever. So just to make sure that the script is easier to reuse. The order of discussion in the script would be asking first for inputs, then identifying the frames and if they are a valid selection, identifying the contents within that frame so that you can calculate the new height for the frame, and finally changing the frame to have that new height while making sure that you are ignoring the constraints. Because there are two functions in Figma, you can resize taking into account the constraints, or you can completely ignore them, which is our target. We're going to start, like I said, by building the script just to make sure we can automate it as we are imagining it. So for now, instead of asking for the user input, let's keep it simple. Let's just set a value as a variable or a constant in this case, saying, okay, padding 60. This is like the beginning of the script, really easy to understand. Second part, let's do something similar. Instead of actually trying to already understand what types of frames you're trying to get and validating everything, let's just check if the frame is valid instead of going through like an array. So here, instead of saying that you can have the full selection, you're just saying one item, just the first item that you have selected, that's the one that Figma will look into it. Even if you select several, only the first that was selected, that one will be the one that will be affected. This, like I said, only for test. We're going to see afterwards how to actually go through several frames, which is the end goal. So let's take a closer look some of the code. So, for example, to make sure that we have something, the selection, you start with this if, saying that the selection is not empty, you can process this code, but if it is empty, you notify the user. Figma.notify basically showcases that small toasters at the bottom of the screen whenever you run a plugin. I'm sure you already saw them. So this is the function to call them. So just Figma.notify, and you can write anything within it as a string so that it shows it's showcased. Okay, so our selection, let's say it's not empty. So if it's not empty, you can check if that item is a frame. And this, a main component, the ones you create for shared libraries or for your file library, can be affected as well, but an instance cannot. So that's why you're making sure that you're only using this to affect frames and components. Also, you have to make sure that the contents within that same item, which is dot children, are not zero. If in any case you have where the children left is zero, you basically have to select a different frame. So which is this call again of select a valid frame via the toaster, saying to the user, okay, if your type is not a frame, if your type is not a component, or if the selected item is empty, you have to select another thing because that one is not a valid frame. So you already identified the frame. how can we actually identify the new height value? Well, you basically want to say that you want to crop there where the green dashed line is. So the easiest way is actually to identify these two green areas, meaning the Y value of the, for example, this item, or could be this item, meaning like the ones that are at the bottom, and this value, which is the height of that specific node. So you have to basically to say the plugin, okay, you have to find out which is the this end position by calculating these two measures. And at the end, if you identify these two measures, you can crop by that same position. So let's try to get it right. Okay, so like you said before, our frame is not empty, so it has children. So you can define this variable. Children will basically be all the nodes within the frame. And then you're basically going to create a sorted array where you're basically going to say, okay, at the beginning of the array, you're going to put the nodes which have the smallest y plus height, meaning, let's just go back to understand. For example, this one would identify this value, which is 0, which is the y position is 0, plus the height. Let's say the height is 40, so this value here will be 40. For these ones, this one will be at the end of the array, meaning that the value here will be the two areas combined, like I said before. So basically this value, this node and this node should have the same value, and those two will be either at the end, one or the other, and for our purpose, that's totally fine. So what we do here is basically creating this function to sort from the smallest value to the biggest value. We start here with the .I and .height, which is basically saying, okay, for the nodes that have that smaller values for both, they are the A's that are at the beginning, while the other ones are pushed to the end. Math round is just to make sure that everything is an integer, it is not working with the fractional values that are not very important for this use case. And then you say, okay, I have the sorted array, the ones that I don't care, and the last one with that array is the one you have to calculate the end position. So you say, okay, within that array, you have to look at the last one. How can we say the last one? You basically say that the length of the children minus 1. Why minus 1? Arrays start at 0, but the length started 1. So a length of an array of 5 is 5, but the array is actually 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So if you want to name the last one, the index will be 4, meaning it's the length of 5 minus 1. And that's why you say here this string. And you basically ask to calculate the sum of its value for the y, for the height, so it's the two green areas, and then add the padding that the user defined. Remember that in this case, we define 60. You already have the value for the height of the frame and the padding as well. So basically now we're just going to that specific frame, adjusting it. So we have to check if the frame needs to be trimmed. If the value for the new height is the same as the current height of the frame doesn't actually need to be trimmed. So it doesn't happen anything besides telling the user that frame is already okay. So the plugin is not only a way to trim things, but to make sure they are already well trimmed. And then here, remember that I said there are two functions for resizing. This is the second one, the one that resizes without constraints. The other one just called resize. So here, you're basically telling that the selected item is resized by width, keeping the current width. So no change, no different value, just the current one. And then the new height, which is the value already defined before. Here, we basically say that you can inform of a new frame size that's suggested to the new height. So we were telling the user, giving feedback that we adjusted the frame and to which height. We can do this specifically here because we just started cutting one frame at a time. And then the other example, you want to evolve this into a plugin. So we're not going to actually showcase like the new height for each frame, but you're going to say, for example, how many frames were affected of the selection. So let's take a look and test it. Here you see exactly the same code I shared with you within Scripter. So basically I hit this one, I created a new file, I gave it a name, and now I have some examples here. So I have an empty example. I have an example where the frame is actually shorter than its contents, and then I just different ones with different heights. You basically grab them all. Sorry, not here. I want this one. You want to grab one by one. That's for the other for the plugin one. So grab one by one and see if it works. And let's see the toast appear at the bottom. So it was adjusted to these heights, and we can confirm that is 60 pixels at the bottom as the padding that was defined. For example, just for having some fun, let's say this one actually should be have a padding of 100. We run it again. It's done. It's adjusted to that size. You can double check. 100. Cool. And then just to make sure that the plugin doesn't try to run, the script doesn't try to run 4 empty frames, we try to run this one as well. And it says, okay, please select a valid frame. Of course, you can give more or less context depending on the errors, but it's really, really important to use the notify or the notify or some plugins have like specific UIs, but to give user feedback to the actions that are taken, because it's really easy to just like go to the plugins menu, you just select one, and then something actually doesn't happen that you understood, but actually something really minor happens within like a note or something because it gave an error. If the plugin doesn't actually inform you that was some kind of error, then you end up having that mistake in your mockup and you don't know why or how you can solve it. So this was like the script one. Let's go back to the presentation. And now let's grab these same ideas and evolve them into a plugin, a full-fledged plugin. The advantage here for building a plugin, even though it gives a bit more, let's say that the way to create them is not very cumbersome, but you have to go through some prerequisites that I'm going to share afterwards. But here, I'm going to evolve the plugin to have input, the user input for a padding value. So each time you run the plugin, you can add different padding values. You can trim multiple frames at the same time, and you can trim in multiple directions. At least let's try to get it closer to that. Not necessarily have the whole example, but example to, okay, let's prepare for having different scenarios where the user can select and input the padding for each different direction. Plugin interfaces. Right now, there's a recent one that was the parameters one. I hope that you already have some plugins in your arsenal or in your toolkit, whatever you want to call it, where you actually use them via parameters, which is like a really cool way to ask for user input without having the need for a custom UI. You can have the three ways. Just menu entries. You select something in the menu and the plugin runs straight away. You can go to parameters, and then you can add different variables or different options for the plugin, and you see our case is going to be based on that. And you can do custom UI where, well, once again, imagination is mostly the limit here, and you can do whatever you need to for your use case. You have here an example of one of my own, but for example, I have like that example I said before about the comments plugin, which is like a really complex UI with like drop downs and cardigans and so on. So it's like whatever you need to create, custom UIs will be a good fit for you. An interesting thing to note, some plugins appear to run only via the menu, but actually they are opening and closing real fast a custom UI, for example. Why, you ask? Having the UI is essential to access browser APIs. So basically, the plugins in Figma work at two different levels if you are doing one for with an UI. The bottom level communicates with Figma directly and is running in the sandbox. The UI is an iframe and it communicates with like the browser itself, and they pass messages between the two, but they are different things. This was done for security reasons for Figma, because it's like a browser-based tool, and they have basically to separate the API so that you can mangle with other people's files too much. So it's important to decide for each case or for which type of automation what you really need, because you can create a custom UI just because you need that UI to have buttons or some inputs, but you might need one where you just need to access some type of browser API, and that's why some plugins run do that open and closing real fast of the UI without showing it anything when you run them through the menu. It's just because they don't have to ask you for any input, but they have to access a browser API of some sorts. But today, we are not going to focus on UI, because with parameters, I think that for whoever is starting, is a really neat way to ask for input without trying to create an UI and then need to pass messages around, which is a bit more cumbersome. So prerequisites, you have to follow Figma setup guide to have like a working setup for plugins. Their documentation overall is really easy to use for beginners. Of course, you always end up in one place or another that you're not understanding it, you have to go to the forums or something. But overall, it's really great and well written in a easy to understand language. So follow the setup guide. You're gonna basically have to install TypeScript, Node.js. You have to install VS Code if you want to. I personally use VS Code. You don't have to. You can use another IDE. But with VS Code nowadays, you can use Autopilot, which is basically augmented code. So basically, they are suggesting code and comments as you type, and it's great. I have to say, it really knows stuff really fast, especially if you're trying to iterate some functions. It's great, honestly. It even writes full comments that make sense. It's crazy. So for any beginner, it's actually a cool way to advance your code, because you might use some functions that are better than the ones you were trying to create, or at least have some ideas of paths to follow. So let's begin. How to create a plugin in Figma. You go to your avatar on the top right corner, and then you go to the plugins panel. At the bottom, you have like a section for in development where you click the plus. Then two pop-ups will appear. The first one saying that if you want to target Figma design, FigJam, or both. I don't really work with FigJam much, so I don't create for Figma design yet. And then a final pop-up saying if you want an empty plugin where you basically can create anything. You can one which is a run once, and this run once is the ones that are either just for the menu or for the parameters, or one with UI and browser APIs. In the case of the browser APIs, you can also have the possibility to run the plugin via the parameters. So parameters are not exclusive to the run once. The parameters can be used for both as well. This is just one use case that I'm showing. First thing first, to get to the parameters part, we have to edit the manifest.json that is part of the plugin folder that is created by Figma. Here, you start with this, and you'll go basically have to add this. Here, like I'm creating a plugin that only runs via parameters. So I create this function, parameter only true. But if you wanted to use one which you can run with the parameters or not, or the UI and the parameters at the same time, you don't include this specific string. And then for the rest, this basically is the setup of the parameters you're going to ask the user. So we're going to say trim, which is basically the direction. If you want to trim the top, the bottom, the left, the right, both directions, wherever. And padding, which is a specific value. These edits that you see here in JSON are really easy to get from the documentation as well. So always refer back to it. Okay, so we're gonna now edit the code.ts. Within the folder, you'll find two code files, one.ts and one.js. The TS one, is the TypeScript one, is the one where you code. But what Figma actually does is convert it into JavaScript to be run by the application. You don't have to worry about JS, but you have to worry about one specific thing, which is running a build task every time you open VS Code or your IDE. You go to terminal, you go to run build task, and the IDE should find different build tasks for how many plugins you have in development. For example, these are mine. So in this case, I have to hit on trim frame. What does it do? It's activating an automation where every time you edit code.ts and save it, the IDE goes through the specific task of converting it to JS. You don't have to worry about anything else. But do not forget to do this once you start editing. Otherwise, you're gonna be editing your TS file. You go to test it in Figma, and then, oops, you can't actually develop it. You can't actually test it because the development wasn't passed to the JS file. One extra thing I didn't mention, but it's part of the documentation. You can only develop via the Figma app. You can develop via the browser. So it's one thing to take into consideration as well. These for plugins, for scripts, it's okay because the script, like we said, is run within another plugin. So let's start looking at our interface parameters. This is our end goal, is creating the parameters asking for the trim, meaning the direction, and asking for the padding. In the parameters mode, there's this really cool feature where you can actually add a small icon, which is basically 16 by 16, for each type of parameter. So in this case, I created an icon representing each direction. The easiest way I found to do this, I'm not sure that it's the only one, but it's the one I found, is actually to export everything in SVG, open it in a browser, and then just copy the code as the full string and use it to build this. But you don't have to use icons, so this is just like a complementary thing. If you're doing just a plugin for your own, it's probably more than enough to just ask for the parameters. Now, I'm not going to pretend I know everything I'm going to explain for this top part, because this is mostly from the documentation. These parameters actually went through several revisions. I was in the beta, so they changed this and they actually simplified it a bit. It was a bit more cumbersome at the beginning. But most of these codes you grab from the documentations. You don't have to worry much of it. But what is interesting here? Within this set suggestions part, you can understand if the input of the user is valid, meaning I want to ask for a padding. A padding shouldn't be a negative value. Okay, probably not. I want to add more space or make sure the trim is flush, not make it less than 0. Okay, cool. So make sure that the value is not non-negative. Okay, what if the user actually doesn't put a specific number and puts like text? Okay, we can't accept text as input, so let's make sure that it's a number. So in any case, if the number is not a finite number, it gives an error and doesn't allow you to progress further. So you have to correct or with the parameters mode and close the dialog box. The same thing for the non-negative. If it's below 0, then it showcases an error. It doesn't allow you to progress. Then I want to tell you about, just find it. It's here, yeah. So regarding the trims, basically here you set up the big array of trims that appears here. You can have other types of options for your use case, but you're basically defining the text and the icon. Once again, if you don't have an icon, you just delete this part and you get the array for the suggestions. Here you get basically the part of the padding. The padding is a positive value. It is basically the function that you at the top, the set suggestions for number of inputs. That was up here. So this function here, this is basically called afterwards, but is set up at the beginning. So like I said, this part is a bit tricky to understand. It was really tricky for me as well, but it was all content that I was able to grab from documentation or some examples from users. The cool part here is that if you want this example, I can give it to you and you can just refurbish it to your own liking. So as soon as you have like a working version, it's just like changing the content and it should work. Of course, you might have to do some different types of verifications here, but just coming here and making sure that either is like a valid number or valid text that doesn't have numbers and things like that. And this is always within the if portions of the code. Then we have to identify frames within the selection. Okay, so I built a function called test selection, which I call more than once during the plugin. What are you doing here? You're saying, okay, let's empty, have like an empty array called source selection, which comes to be our final output of this function. So that's what we have in here in return. And for any frame that, for any node, sorry, within our selection that is either a frame or a component, if you remember the case of the script is exactly the same, you have a frame or a component and it's valid, okay, grab those and you put it within this new array. So basically grabbing these nodes that come for when we start the function, which is a selection of the user, and we make sure that they are either a frame or a component, so they are picked for a new array. And this new array is the one that you're going to then affect afterwards. Then other parts of the code that are checking it. One of the tricky things of parameters that basically they allow for to check if if you are actually having a frame selected before advancing as well. But you have to make sure that if you even have a frame, that frame is confirmed what you're on, because you have to make sure that it's not empty, the selection is still valid. So basically just making sure that the plugin won't like start throwing errors just because we didn't think of a possibility here or there. So I make sure that to verify this like 3 or 4 times in this specific plugin. Here you can see the run event is what happens once you basically confirm that the parameters were valid. So this function here was the one that I showcased before. And if you have the parameters, you basically can, no, sorry, the other way around. Yeah, okay. So if you have valid parameters from the other function, you can then start the function below, which is the start plugin with parameter sort. I was getting the other way around. And basically here, you grab the parameters from the other function, the trim direction and the padding value, and to start using them for your calculations. Here we define the message, the part of the message that trim becomes the trim size constant. The value of the padding goes to padding. the parameters actually grab strings and not necessarily numbers. So we have to make sure that that value is converted to a number, and that's why we have this parse integer here, just to make sure that the string is converted to a number. Remember that you already confirmed that you are only inputting numbers and not necessarily text. So we at least make sure that we are receiving only digits, but since those digits are transferred in a string, you have to convert that string into integer. I'm using integer just to make sure that the padding is like a specific value, like doesn't have like a fraction. It's like 10 and not 10.25, because I don't use .25 or dot wherever for paddings anywhere. So I want to make sure that my paddings are not non-fractional, and that's why I don't use parse float. If for some reason you want to use like padding that is 10.25, for example, instead of parse int, use parse float or number. There are two other possibilities. Then we set a variable to become our success metric. Remember when before I said that we could tell the user how many frames were actually adjusted from that specific selection you did? That's going to be our success metric, is saying, okay, our adjusted frames start at 0, but each time that we change the height of a frame, you're going to add a number, and you say, okay, we affected 1, we affected 2. Okay, you affected 2 of a selection of 10, and you tell that to the user. Okay, but then here, this once again checking the selection. If the selection is empty, once again, we make sure that the user knows that and has to select a frame. This one, I'm almost certain that the user will never see, because of the checks we do during the actually use of the parameters. Because if you start the parameters without the frame selected, it will tell you. Okay, that's cool, but just keep in mind that if you have you have a fallback. Okay, you should have all errors considered, which is even better. Otherwise, we can actually do, once again, running the test selection. Remember the other function I showed you. So you basically test the selection for the current selection in that page. If you have to understand like the tree structure of frame, you basically have Figma, which is like the global object, and then you have document nodes. The document node have pages, and within pages you have all the other nodes. So basically that's the structure you can call nodes from. If the source selection is not 0, so the length, once again, this is an array that we have here, and the array, if it's 0, then doesn't have anything within it, and then you can actually proceed. So if, for example, the length is 0, we have to tell the user once again, please select a frame. This shouldn't be a possibility, once again, because the parameters checks won't allow you to run anything with actually having a frame selected, but having a fallback, once again, just making sure that nothing will pass. Now, going back to that idea of not changing just one frame, but changing several frames at the same time. Okay, so you have an array of all the valid selection, which is a source selection. You're going to say that for each node within that selection, that we already know that are frames, you have to make sure that you grab the frame width, because you're going to use it afterwards, and then you make sure that the contents exist, that the frame is not empty. And this is, once again, making sure that the array of children is above 0. The same thing that we did before for the length here, making again. Okay, the frame contains children, it passed the test. Okay, so let's say that the children, this array, is stored here, and then you start to create a sort function, exactly the same as we did before. Here I just called it var_children_y for a specific reason. Remember that we're preparing the plugin to then have those possibilities to trim on top, on bottom, on left, on right. This specific thing here that is just for the y values, allows us to calculate for the bottom, and will allow us to calculate for the top as well. So basically you have to make two sorts. You have to make the y sort and then the x sort, just so you can understand where the new height and new width will be grabbed from. Just going to showcase the example for bottom here as well, but just to understand why I did this specific difference from the script. Here we do the same. We sort out the frame from the smallest position of bottom position of a node, like for example the top nav, that was the 40 pixel that I said, and then we sort until the last positions, which gives you the new height. The same thing as before. And then we calculate the same thing. The new height value is grabbing the lowest position possible and then adding a padding value. Our padding value can be 0, could be 5,000. Doesn't matter. The plugin will set that. We will add it here. Now, to finish it up, let's change the property height. I blurred this a bit, but I'm preparing the plugin to have everything. And yes, this is a new plugin. I'm not sure when I'm going to release it, but I'm going to release it in the community probably during the beginning of the next year. So I'm preparing everything, but here is basically saying, okay, for all those cases that you have for the trim, what's going to happen? Here, the case for the bottom, you're going to say the same thing as we did before, which is resizing without constraints and using the two widths. Here I define the variable for the frame width, but you could use the same thing, saying node.width as before. And also the metric, adding that success metric to our plugin, which I think is always important to give some more context to the user. Okay, so you say before actually resizing, you can access the current height of the frame and compare it to the new value of the height. And if it is different, then you have to actually change and do the adjustment of the frame. In this scenario, to avoid writing more code, we are technically trimming everything, even if it doesn't need to be trimmed. But since you are giving that adjustment, at least the user knows that, okay, I probably selected 100, but only 90 needed to be trimmed. 10 of them were already okay. If the user runs it again, it will say that it ran for selection of 100, but it actually didn't affect none. So the user knows, okay, it's done, it's ready for handoff. Just remember to do it before the resize, otherwise, once you try to calculate the node height, it's going to be the same as new height. And then to finish it all up, remember the same thing as Figma.notify. Use that for scripts, because if you do close plugin, you actually close the scripter, which is not that amazing. But here, you should use to finish the plugin, or anytime you have to finish it up, because the user input was invalid or the plugin is throwing some type of error, you can do a Figma.close plugin and use the same notation afterwards to write a message. What I'm doing a bit more evolved here, as you might have seen here in these scenarios, is I'm using emojis. I think it's a cool way to give a bit more information without adding much text, just like success, warning, error, different emojis to exemplify different states of the plugin. And then you have the variable adjusted frames. Remember, you're adding to it, and you say a string, adjusted frames, say 10, frames adjusted off. Let's say that our sub/selection.length was 100, saying just we have an array and you're calculating how many things are within it. 10 of what are selected were adjusted, and you show that message for 2 seconds. You can put a longer timeout if it's like a closed plugin, but for example, for Notify, have smaller times. If you have like a plugin that is doing lots of things at the same time, you want to showcase or probably want to show more of those, so it's important to reduce the timeout. And then now let's test the plugin. So let's go here. And you ask trim. Here you say it's still in development, so it's not like a already published one. But you can actually tab, which is always the way to interact with the parameters. And then you have all the options. In this case, you only have bottom working, but you have bottom working and you have the padding value. So let's use the same example as before, 60. And let's see what happened. Oh, let me try one thing. Let me actually showcase you an error. See, please enter a numeric value. It's the example of having text in the middle of a number or just having text. Let's try a negative number. It's not allowing to put a negative number either. So let's say 60. And voila, it goes through everything and it says that only 4 frames were rejected or 5 selected. In this specific case, it wasn't because they were already okay, it was because this one was empty. So that's why it wasn't adjusted either. It didn't even get to the function where it actually adds values. So it will never add that value for that specific frame because it was discarded way before. So here you can do something. Let's try once again to run it and see what happens. Okay, 0 frames adjusted or 5 selected. Exactly the outcome we were expecting. Let's just try, just for the fun of it, try bottom, but instead of saying 60, let's say 100. What happens? It goes to 100. So as you can see, these are the scenarios where it would work, meaning making the frame larger or making it shorter, discarding empty frames. Here, let's do one more test. Here, discarding a situation where the user selection is not valid because it's selecting something that is not a frame. It doesn't even allow you to get any further, so we have to basically get out of the parameters, start the parameters again, and go through all the functions. Here, if you try to look for it, you don't have matches, but you look for bottom. If you look for, okay, I actually have to sort it out. I don't know why it doesn't have a match for bottom. It should be
try case sensitive. There exactly. You go. It's case sensitive.
So that's the problem, and I have to find a way that actually not amendable. And well, this is mostly the function of the plugin. It's not a really complex one, but for me, if I'm going to save like 2 minutes a day, okay, but it's going to save me actually the process of doing it, so I can actually put my mind into doing some more high level, higher value tasks. So now you have basically the plugin ready. You just have to make sure that you test with different scenarios. You make sure you have all exclusions. You have like tested with a really big number of frames because performance. I'm not like I really don't have much knowledge about it yet, but performance. If you start to look for some plugins that actually transverse everything, you might actually end up breaking, not breaking, but like making a crash to the app. For example, find and replace plugin. If it transverses everything, if you have like a really large file with lots of nodes, it's going to take a long time to go through everything. It's going to take a lot of memory, and it might actually create an exception in throwing because it doesn't have enough memory. After that, and you are really pretty sure that it's run to be published or not, you can just keep it for yourself, like I said. It's no problem having it developed, but you can publish for the community. All of us that might benefit from it will thank you, or you can even publish just for org, or for example, something that is really specific for your organization, like something like a winter for metrics or for measures or for colors, for example, something that's really targeted for your organization audience. You can publish if you are part of an org plan, which is like a really cool feature. So are you looking forward to start? If you're ready to automate that really annoying task that you thought of before. I really want to challenge you to try to make your first or second or third script or plugin until end of the year. Make it like your Christmas break project, and try to do like something really simple, as just, for example, understanding if you can rename a frame with like a variable, just really something small, because just for you to start getting the understanding of how things are targeted, how you can create an array, how you can identify within that array which types of nodes you want to affect. It's really important for you just to think of those small things, because a plugin is not actually a really complex thing altogether. It's like a complex thing because it's comprised of really small things and steps. So go through that process of looking at your task or your workflow, putting it in small pieces, try to understand if some of those small pieces are already automated in the community or the whole thing or not. And if not, like, try to automate part of it. Even if it's just a small thing, you start to build from there. Create a function, then you create another function, and create another function, and then you call them all up, and you created the workflow working. I wanted to showcase here scripts, just because for anyone starting, it's easier to see if it's something they'll like or something they'll be into, because you don't have to install lots of different things and get it like a full setup working, and like some of frustration of starting. It's like really low level of risk of entrance. You just go there, you just start to make things work, and I think it's a really fun way to interact with your files, and it might actually give you more ideas of ways to automate other things while you start with those small things, because some things that you actually do every day, don't ever thought about automating, might be a good candidate for it. So it's time for some Q&A. If you have some questions, I'll try my best to reply. That's mostly it.
Rui, we lost a couple of people along the way, but I'm pretty sure that everyone is enjoying. It's just getting late for some people, for sure. But yeah, anyone has questions? If you don't want to open the microphone, you can actually drop them also on the chat or something, and we'll do our best to answer them. Well, Rui is. I'm just here to host the thing. I still need to like rewatch this all over again and then program it by myself and learn a little bit about TypeScript too.
Yeah, like I was saying, is the TypeScript is mostly a way to make sure that your JavaScript code is affecting the right things. It's like a notation for example, when you create an array, you say that array is for that type of nodes. So it's like a good way to tell the computer what you are expecting to do, and then if you are not actually achieving that, it will give you like error messages that are a bit more targeted and a bit more specific. I honestly almost never do it. I just want things to start working and be automated. But as you start like creating more complex stuff, it becomes easier to actually use it. And I want to look into it at a later stage. So did anyone actually have any idea to automate anything? Do you want actually going to think about it with us for a minute? Feel free.
That chilling silence of awkwardness.
People are just like, I have no idea what he talked about. He didn't explain it properly.
No, you did.
Most honestly, my process is trial and error, and trying to find code that is in the forums or somewhere, and trying to refurbish and turn it around to whatever I need. Like I said, I'm not experienced code or anything. I just like to do it and see things start working and being really fast. So That's why I told you, like, start small, because it's easier for you to understand. Like, when I
Mhm.
started doing my first one, copy pasta, I struggled with like very stupid stuff, like just trying to iterate for along the array. And now I use it honestly for all plugins I create so far, because you basically have to go to a selection and you say, okay, go through each one of the selection and do checks and effect. And it's really, really common for everything. So honestly, if you are start with none of those, because it's something that's really we really need to for most plugins. Of course, for example, I don't know why, but I'm using this example a lot today. But like the comments plugin, it doesn't actually go through an array of your selection, but you'll go through an array of comments. So once
Mhm.
again, arrays are really important. And if you go to one of those two examples, either Grasshopper or Odin project, you'll see that
Mhm.
they give lots of examples, especially in Odin project. Grasshopper takes a bit longer to get there. But honestly, if you are, I never used Duolingo, but I think Grasshopper is most likely the same thing, but for code.
Okay.
You basically have
Cool.
like daily challenges and daily puzzles. It's not never really complex.
When you
Um,
talked about it, it felt a little bit like Swift Playground on the iPad, which is, although Swift Playgrounds is a little bit more like a very complex game, it is like step by step you learn how Swift works, and then eventually you can actually start programming. But it's
mhm.
interesting to know that also Google also has something for that, which is a little bit of a more used language in terms of globally. Not that Swift isn't used; it's very much used now. Swift UI,
Yeah.
but it's interesting to see that everyone is taking similar approaches to that because it makes sense, and it
Building
also
that
helps.
developer base,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah, and Swift Playgrounds is great because you can also teach kids how to code by doing
Mhm.
really small things, and you have like a little character working
Yeah, the
on the
same. The
iPad.
grasshopper is like the small grasshopper, and like lots of illustration. So um, I think it's a bit kid oriented too. But honestly,
Hmm.
for anyone who's like not that young, but ever actually worked with code, it's like the ways of thinking about things are basically the
Yeah,
same. You basically are like a child right now trying to code, so you don't have any knowledge. You have to start any somewhere. Those
yeah,
type of things. Personally, for me, I prefer to look at it like in the way of small puzzles than try to read like a free scroll page of
hmm,
really dense text trying to explain you a concept.
yeah,
Because the thing here is, okay, if you want to try to understand the performance and what's happening in the background and how it will affect your code, okay, you have to read the full
do
page and
the full
actually,
thing. Yeah,
yeah, you're going to create like really good plugins that are really complex. Okay, that's another level. That's not my level and not even the purpose of today. But you can start to create complex things by just putting lots of small things that are simple together. Not necessarily that it's going to be easy at the beginning if you never did it, but honestly, you just have to find the things where you find
yeah.
the like where you can leverage, like the arrays, like I was saying. It's something that as soon as I understood, I was like, I'm going to use this for almost anything. So as you basically conquer this, you conquer that. The same thing with design. You have to understand like the fundamentals to then create like
Yeah,
a complex layout. So it's the same thing here.
no, it's really cool. Rui, thank you very much for this.
Thank you. Thank you
Um,
for everyone who watched, and I hope you enjoyed and learned a thing or two. And my channels are open, so if you have any doubts, if you're like an example, you want to start automating, you just like want to a tip or two, I'll try quite with it to help.
and
And
if
install my
you
plugins. Shameless plug.
yeah, and if you want to talk with Rui and other people, best place to do it right now is on the Discord. If you're not on the Discord, you can actually join it through the homepage of friends.figma.com. So there's a little button over there that will direct you to the Discord. Um, by the way, don't forget to validate your identity once you join Discord, because if you don't validate your identity, you can't actually see all the channels and interact with everyone. Okay, we have like 5 minutes, and I was just gonna showcase really fast the new features that just came out on FigJam because we always like to share what's new. So I'm going to share my screen, but I already shared the link with everyone. So if you want to join me on the FigJam file, you can join me too. But I'm going to be sharing screen anyways. So FigJam launched about 3 or 4 new features since last meetup. Figma also has a new one on comments, but comments have actually been a little bit delayed. So not everyone has access. I don't, for example. We were talking about today as someone from a different team already had it on their files, but we didn't. But yeah, what we actually have right now is the first one is media, and I was talking about this in the beginning. You actually have the option to bring Figma links, YouTube links, Vimeo, Loom, Spotify playlists, and CodePen objects. So if I just want to drop a Spotify playlist, I can just go to my Spotify here. Give me a second. You're not going to see it. I'm going to get this one. Copy a link, drop it, paste. And if it's open, it should supposedly work here. Then probably this one isn't open. I need to check out. Oh, wait. I think this is not the right code. I think the right code is the embed. Give me a second here. I'm going to do the same thing. Because I saw people having actually embeds. Let's see if that works. Exactly. So you can actually have like a full Spotify playlist inside the file that is playing, and I almost got deaf about it. The same with YouTube videos, Loom recordings, if you have them. A lot of people use them for documentation. And then Figma files, Figma embeds. If you click on any of the links, it's going to open the file. For example, I'm going to get these that I'm going to share with everyone afterwards. You can drop a link there. It needs to be public to get the preview, but you get the preview there. And if you click on view, you will get the Figma preview like you have on an embed. Then you can navigate the file and everything else. So brings a little bit more interactivity into your FigJam files. It's not just as static as it was before. It's a really cool thing. Then second update, if you haven't seen it, you now don't only have the markers, but you also have the highlighters to highlight content. And you now have an eraser that it's going to delete those lines. So instead of actually having to go with your mouse and select those lines, now you have a more natural eraser object. So you can actually go and delete the lines. It still deletes the full line because you're actually selecting a full object, but it's a really interesting way. It's a really interesting tool. Right now, I think if you do Shift P, you get pen. Shift E, you get eraser. No, I'm right. I'm wrong. What is it? What's the shortcut? Shift backspace. Sorry, you got to do eraser and Shift M. You get the highlighter. So Shift P, Shift M, and Shift backspace, and you get the eraser. And that's it. These are the new updates that we have here. If you haven't used them too, widgets there's a bunch of them always coming up, really cool ones. So there's a lot of really cool things that you can use here that make your FigJam boards a little bit more interactive. Great, not just for communication and research work, but also for team building and stuff like that. I love things like Flip a Coin or Tic-Tac-Toe, which are just simple and really cool to just play with people. But yeah, that's it. These are the updates. I'm now going to stop sharing. Thanks everyone that stayed to the end, René and Larry. Thanks, Rui, for being here today, and I hope everyone enjoyed it. And I hope everyone enjoyed it, and then can see all of you in some of our next meetups in English, because I know that's a key part of it. Okay, bye everyone. See you next time.